Hello, everyone. Welcome to our Monday noon session. We've been studying Mishnah together all year, and we'll keep studying Mishnah again next year, or heading into next year. We'll start up again in August. But we're going to take a little hiatus over the summer, and thinking about that, I realized that, I also have these classes that I'm starting to teach today, and I thought maybe I'd end the class earlier than was ideal. When Yonathan and Hannah kind of valiantly offered to give a couple of classes to take us here into the end of the year, and I'm really excited to learn with them. And I just want to say that I sort of, as I announced this last week, I said, I kind of, I sort of like off the cuff just sort of joked and said, these young scholars, and it's sort of funny because, I'm not old and distinguished enough to be able to say such things, but I really do. I want to just say I actually mean it. Like, these are a couple of real scholars, like people who have real depth of learning, and have always impressed me with their knowledge of Torah and love of Torah. And so I'm really grateful to Yonathan and Hannah for being available and for sharing with us some Torah. So without further ado, most of you know Dr. Yonathan Reches. He's always learning with us, and you know him by his incredible pulls from out of the side of the tradition, some midrash that is perfect for what we're doing that you've never heard of. You know him for asking provocative questions that startled me at first and then turn out to be exactly the right question. You know him for just being a wonderful mind. And we all know him at Ikar for also being a wonderful heart. And I'm sure you're going to see part of both of those great assets that Yonathan has today. And so without further ado, Yonathan Reches.
Thank you, Rabbi. That was a great introduction. And thank you all for coming, even though Rabbi's not teaching this one, or maybe y'all didn't realize that. Yeah, so the topic that I wanted to cover, which is not a Mishnah topic, everything's a Mishnah topic, right? But we're not studying the Mishnah today, is vegetarianism in Judaism. I'm a vegetarian, and I have been for a very long time. I know a lot of Ikarites are. I know a few Ikarite vegans also, and I know one particularly famous Ikarite vegetarian. But I don't know of anyone who came into vegetarianism by way of Judaism, who was just so religious that they thought, because I'm this, very observant Jew, I must be vegetarian. Usually you come into it some other way. This was my experience, at least, and you kind of are forced to then ask yourself, well, what does Judaism have to say about this separate set of moral values that I have? Is Judaism really mute about this issue? And it turns out that it's not. It has a lot to say. So we're going to look into that. This lesson was originally a series of 6 lessons that a group of us just studied together at the beginning of COVID, and I see at least 2 of those people here. So y'all have seen this before, but that's fine. Y'all can enjoy this again. I'm gonna put a link to the study sheet in the chat, even though my study sheets are not as cool as Rabbi Kasher's. So the first question I kind of want to turn to the group on is what's the challenge here? What's, for me as a vegetarian Jew, why is vegetarianism in Judaism such a challenge? I'm going to try to look at the participants to see who's raising a hand. Okay, Joe is raising a physical hand. Go ahead, Joe.
At least according to the Torah, it would be a challenge because the Torah mandates animal sacrifices and eating those sacrifices.
Yes, right. So according to the literal pshat level of the Torah, like there's a lot of animal killing going on, right? The sacrifices, which most of which were eaten, are definitely a good example of that. Matt, you raised your hand briefly. Did you have anything to say also?
Yeah, I can find a way to ignore that because, well, we don't have the temple, blah, blah, blah.
Uh-huh.
But even so, if I've got rules for how to do something, it kind of implies to me I have to do that thing.
Sure.
If I have rules for how to eat meat, to my mind, that implies I should eat meat. I think that's a deeper problem for modern. I mean, I can get away with it, but that would be my question, my problem.
Sure. I think those two are the biggest issues you run into is the animal sacrifices and the commandments around slaughter. And particularly, and we'll get into this text in a minute, but the Torah explicitly says you are permitted to eat meat, right? Like there's an actual verse that says, go ahead and eat as much meat as you want. There's two verses that say that. So you run into a challenge of, well, they're open and shut case, right? Like eating meat's fine. And maybe within a certain set of restrictions that have certain intentions, maybe not, maybe you can eat meat, but you can't eat everything, right? But our tradition also has a way of taking texts and reading much deeper meaning into them than the simple meaning. So, you think of examples like slavery and the death penalty, which the Torah seems to be comfortable with, and the rabbis not so much. And by the time we get rabbinic Judaism, they don't look the same as if all we had was the written Torah. So with that, let's try to, we should definitely bless for Torah study before we start reading from the Torah. You're invited to bless with me. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. And now let me see if I can share my screen. Is everybody able to open my Google Doc? Give me a thumbs up or thumbs down. Great. Okay, I'm still going to share it. So the verses in Deuteronomy chapter 12, and I really can't include in here every verse that kind of endorses meat eating because there's so many of them. But these 5 seem particularly pertinent. They say, take heed to thyself. This is the JPS translation, so it's a bit thy, thou heavy. Take heed to thyself that thou offer not thy burnt offerings in every place that thou seest, but in the place where the Lord shall choose in one of thy tribes, there thou shalt offer thy burnt offerings, and there thou shalt do all that I command thee. Notwithstanding, thou mayst kill and eat flesh within all thy gates, after all the desire of thy soul, according to the blessing of the Lord thy God, which God hath given thee. The unclean and the clean may eat thereof, as of the gazelle and as of the hart. Only ye shall not eat the blood, thou shalt pour it out upon the earth as water. And then skipping a few verses, when the Lord thy God shall enlarge thy border, as God has promised thee, and thou shalt say, I will eat flesh, because thy soul desireth to eat flesh, thou mayst eat flesh after all the desire of thy soul. So at this point, I do want to kind of open the discussion into what might be some of the subtext of what's going on in these verses. And I'm seeing Florine.
I'm really, really confused by the use of the word soul, the desire of one's soul, in terms of other things that we've learned in Judaism, in terms of respect for animals, guardianship of the creation. It's a very limited definition. It's not one that I know of for the word soul. And I spent a year studying the Jewish concepts of the soul. So see if you can explain.
Okay, so that's great. So Florine takes us back to Genesis, which, I mean, almost any good Torah study is going to have to do at some point. And what is the soul doing here? And I don't have a great question. other than a great answer, I'm sorry, other than that the Torah says whatever your soul desires to do in this situation. But I think you are at least digging into the right sort of direction of, something is, there would have been a simpler way to say this, right? There would have been a more straightforward, if God had just wanted to say, go eat meat, why bring the desire of your soul into it?
Times.
3 times.
Mhm.
Yeah. Payam.
I mean, I think one view is a linear view of Torah, where you start off in the idealistic sense in Genesis, that's the idealistic world to live in, and then because of everything that happens, especially by the time you get to Deuteronomy, those ideals become practicality. And so all of these things that are added later on, especially in Deuteronomy, because people are just complaining, and it's a compromise between God and people. And I think God at a certain point gets tired of these Israelites complaining all the time and just keeps on adding stuff. So I think from a moral standpoint, I don't think it's correct, or the viewpoint that just because it says X during a later part, usurps what it says in an earlier part in terms of a moralistic viewpoint.
Right. That is a very Jewish way of seeing the world, right? That the world that we are born into is not necessarily a morally correct world, that we were designed as to be different beings from the beings that we are right now. And there are forces in the world, and not all of them good, that cause us to be different from kind of the starting place where we were in the Garden of Eden. Well, to walk through this idea, I wanted to pull 2 sources, and they're 2 very different sources. The first, which is just 1 paragraph and not really the main religious source that I want to look at, is from a Yiddish author named Isaac Bashevis Singer. And he's great. If you haven't read anything by him, you really should, and I really recommend Shosha. It's a great insight into what it looked like to live in Poland shortly before the Nazi invasion. He himself did flee Poland to the United States, where he continued to write in Yiddish, and he's the only Yiddish author to ever win a Nobel Prize in Literature. He was an avid vegetarian. He was not particularly religiously observant, but he was very spiritually inclined. And he made a comparison that I think we can be comfortable with him making it, but probably most of us shouldn't. He frequently made the comparison between the raising and the killing of animals and the Holocaust. And specifically what he said is when a human kills an animal for food, he's neglecting his own hunger for justice. Man prays for mercy, but is unwilling to extend it to others. Why should man then expect mercy from God? It's unfair to expect something that you're not willing to give. It is inconsistent. I can never accept inconsistency or injustice, even if it comes from God. If there would come a voice from God saying, I'm against vegetarianism, I would say, well, I'm for it. This is how strongly I feel in this regard. All right, so what kind of an argument is he making here? Rabbi Kasher is lifting a physical hand.
Sorry, I'm not used to raising my hand on that. I'm always on the other end. No, but I mean, I was going to say this is the argument that I think is threatening to, this is why religious people often dismiss vegetarianism, because it's like, it seems to represent, I'm sort of answering the question from the other end, but it often, I found that in my religious communities, vegetarianism has often been sort of sneered at. And it's because it represents some idea that like, no, this moral is better than our religion, higher than our religion. And Bashevis Singer is saying even higher than God. It's absolutely true in a way that is like beyond even the Torah itself. You don't need the Torah to know that this is right. You don't need God to know that this is right.
Right. Yeah, and he's basing this all on an emotional argument. He's got no evidence in the Jewish sense of things to back him up, which, I mean, to me doesn't invalidate his argument, but it's certainly not a rabbinic argument. Yes, Matt.
This actually, his argument actually don't hold a lot of theological positions, but if I were, one of the things that sort of sits in my brain is that I can accept the Torah if one of the things I say is there are messages there that I'm supposed to reject. I am supposed to say, I don't care that you told me to do that. That's wrong because you've given me a bigger truth. For me, the bigger truth is be good to the stranger. And I can accept, I don't see his logic. I could fill it in. There is be good to the stranger. And that means justice and mercy. And that includes animals because we've got to really be sure. And I will put in the same place, there are the rules about homosexuality. And I really feel that we are meant to say, yes, that's a rule. Yes, it's backed up. And I have to reject it because it is against the other thing. I cannot accept that the Torah is perfect and true as a human being. And I'm going to even put on my from God hat, which I don't wear. As a human being, I am supposed to reject some of Torah because there is morality that is more important. So Rabbi Kasher and I just took two opposing sides.
No, I don't know that necessarily Rabbi Kasher opposed you so much as
he was
clarified the ramifications, right, in terms of like how the religion views that perspective, right? And I think it's beautiful, and I think first of all, it's something that the rabbis do often when they want to do it, right? When the rabbis decide that there's something in the Torah that they don't like, they find ways to make it go away. I mean, sorry, Rabbi, but they do, right? So like we see a lot of points in the tradition. I mean, sota, right? The bitter waters for an adulterous woman don't get practiced anymore, and the rabbis found, without completely overturning the Torah and saying, you know, the Torah is wrong, they found a way to make that ritual not be practicable anymore. And I think that does go, I mean, there's a huge component of how intuition fits into commandments, right? That we have the chukim and the mishpatim, the rules that we could intuit or that we can understand, and the rules that are beyond our understanding. And I think you're kind of creating a third category, which is like, oh, I understand this rule, but I have a deeper human understanding that also overturns this rule. And I think that's beautiful. I mean, easy for me to say as a person who really, who really believes in vegetarianism. But there is another approach, which is, I would say, probably more common in the rabbinic sources, which is to nitpick at a text, and sometimes you get to the same destination by a very different path. And that's the next one that I wanted to look at, which is a writing by Rabbi Avraham Yitzchak Cohen Cook, known as Rabbi Cook in Israel. He is such a huge figure. I mean, he was born in what's now Latvia, was the Russian Empire, and he left in similar circumstances to Singer for similar reasons. He did not move to the United States, he moved to Israel, and he really helps to form the institutions that are now known as the Chief Rabbinate of Israel. And again, it's just really difficult to overstate his contribution to the way that Judaism functions in Israel. He himself was not a vegetarian. Strangely enough, when you read his works, it's kind of hard to believe, but he wrote a series of essays that were collected by one of his students after his death and compiled into a treatise called A Vision of Vegetarianism and Peace. And I highly recommend to anyone who's interested to go find this online. It's available in an English translation in PDF multiple different English translations, so you can even pick which one you like. And it's a 60-page document. We can't possibly cover all of it today, so I picked a little bit out of it to focus on. And like many things in our tradition, Rabbi Kook kind of sits this argument on two legs. One is the mitzvah leg and the other is the agada leg. So mitzvah is like everything that's connected to the commandments. God says, here's how you eat meat and so on. And the agada is stories, and I'm including in this maybe a little bit recklessly, but I'm including in this both stories that are past within the Torah and stories that are future within the works of the prophets. He does a great job covering some really obscure mitzvahs that I've never heard a better explanation for, like the covering of the blood and like the ban on the interweaving of different threads. But I think I really like, if you're really into those obscure mitzvahs, I hope you go and read into this because it's great. But for this crowd, I think the agada side within the time constraints that we're working with is just more interesting and more accessible. So I drilled into that side. And he starts again, that he takes us, just like Florine did, right back to the story of creation and tells us, like, well, hold on, the world was created with this vision, and he goes all the way to the end times with a temple service that does not include animal sacrifice, and he claims that the temple service in the future will not include animal sacrifices. It'll only include the sacrifices of grain and of wine. But let's start by going back to Genesis. So he says, the Torah has already testified that at one time, all of humanity was encouraged to raise itself to this exalted moral state of not shedding blood in order to obtain food, as our sages explained in their writings, which prove that the first human being was not allowed meat as food. Every tree yielding seed shall be yours for food. That's Genesis 1:29. Only after the children of Noah came, following the flood, was the eating of meat permitted to them. Every moving thing that liveth shall be for food for you, as with the garden herbs I give you everything. That's Genesis 9:3. And his reading here is not uncommon. I mean, all the major commentators agree, or maybe Rabbi Kasher will tell me that I'm wrong and not all of them agree, but certainly a large number of the major commentators agree that when the human beings were created in the Garden of Eden, we were permitted to eat only plants. And then following the flood, we were extended the permission by God to eat meat. And then Rabbi Kook extends that argument and says how ludicrous it would be if humanity, as long as its impurities are within it, would hypocritically turn to a far-fetched way of righteousness, showing itself to be righteous only with regard to animals, as if all accounts between human beings created in the divine image had been settled, as if everything had already been set aright and the rule of evil and falsehood had been banished, as if hatred between peoples, national rivalries, racial animosity, and family strife, which cause so many mortal casualties and spill so much blood, as if all of these had already disappeared from the earth, and the only way left in which to elevate human piety was to attend to the establishment of a moral foundation in regards to animals. All right, so who feels like they could maybe like speak out his line of reasoning? Agnes, go ahead.
It feels like he's saying that, yes, a higher spiritual standard, moral standard would be to not eat animals, but because human life has a higher status than animal life, until we really feel that we've elevated ourselves to the status of protecting all human life, it's like buying a wedding cake decoration before you made the wedding cake. It's like this is this first priority that we should attend to.
That's a great comparison. Yes. Right. And his like little proof text for this is the flood. And though he doesn't come out and say it, it really sounds like he's implying that one of the sins of the generation of the flood was cannibalism. Right. They're like, we just couldn't not eat meat. Right. Like, we need meat, and God didn't give us that right at all. So we just ate everything. Right. Oh, Jen, yeah, I saw when you joined, you were Jennifer. And I was like, wait, who's Jennifer? And now I see you're Jen.
I wish it would stop doing that. Yeah, I feel like if I'm reading it right, he's also making this argument that feels really odd to me, that if we treat animals the way we treat people in a positive way, then we'll treat people the way we treat animals in a negative way.
Yes.
The other side of that, which, wow, that's an interesting turn to go to.
Sure. I think that's exactly what he's saying. And it doesn't seem like such solid ground to be standing on logically. So okay, I'm going to do the sharing again. Right. And then he goes on to say, therefore, it is not a fitting standard for humanity in general, as long as humanity remains in its baseness. There is no doubt that if the prohibition of the killing of animals was made known as a religious and moral pronouncement, when the animal-like craving to eat meat would become overpowering, it would then make no distinction between the flesh of human beings and the flesh of animals. The eating of human flesh would become so natural that once the wide gap between human beings and animals in terms of the relative value of their lives has been breached, there would no longer be any trace of the natural abhorrence to this practice. There's exactly what Jen said, right? It's like, well, we need hierarchy because we understand that, we treat people well, but if you take hierarchy away, then man, it's just gonna be anarchy, right? Like in the bad sense, like we just don't know what's gonna happen. Yeah, Florine.
This is really interesting because it is implying cannibalism as a form of eating meat. So in the laws of kashrut, have we made an error by not including cannibalism in the laws of kashrut? And the other question I have is, does this imply that the laws of kashrut were there temporarily just to limit the amount of meat we could eat? And hopefully we would grow out of it. What are questions about the laws of kashrut?
So as regards the second question, he does talk about this in the text in the direction of the mitzvot. Remember, I mentioned that there's the mitzvot and the Agadah part, and he goes very deep into these different commandments that regulate our relationship with animals. And if I were to simplify his argument into one or two sentences, I would say basically that God gave us as many restrictions as we can probably manage until our souls are redeemed, and that these restrictions, all of them contain little secrets, little hints that point us to understand that we really shouldn't be eating meat. I'll give one example that I happen to remember, but I don't want to go too far in that direction because it's a very deep discussion. I don't think we can do it justice in the time we have, but there's a commandment that when you hunt an animal, you spill its blood on the ground and then you cover the blood. You don't do that for a domesticated animal that you slaughter. He makes the argument that we cover the blood because covering something is a sign of shame, right? And so we go, when we're out, we cover it because we're ashamed that we killed that animal. But if we did that in our slaughterhouses, then the shame would be too great to bear. Buy that, don't buy that. I mean, you might not, but this is the sort of argument that he makes regarding the mitzvot. regarding your first question about kashrut and cannibalism, we have a rabbi handy that I'll defer to because I don't feel qualified to answer that question. Rabbi Kasher, do you have any insights on that?
On what? Whether it's kosher to eat people?
Well, kind of like what the, sure. I mean, to simplify Florian's question a little bit, what's the deal with the kashrut of eating people?
It is definitely forbidden, but it's not a kashrut issue. It's a murder issue. And in fact, in some ways, you can make the point by saying that human milk is not considered dairy. It's a different category of like that's not, we're not considered food.
Oh, cool. I didn't realize that. I mean, I knew killing was not allowed. Human milk not considered dairy. There you go. All right, so we're still running into the issue, right? He's made this nice logical construction of like, we start out being able to eat only vegetables, and then that's a problem, so we get to eat meat. Like, he still hasn't resolved the fact that the Torah tells us, oh yeah, go ahead and eat meat, right? And that's his next step. With the coming of the permission to eat meat, after the sacralization of the mitzvot by the giving of the Torah qualifies the permission as suggested by the words. And this is a verse we just we read up front. When you say, I shall eat meat, for you have the urge to eat meat, you may eat meat whenever you wish. And this is a different translation. I kept the translation of Rabbi Cook's work rather than bringing the JPS translation into here. But this was the part that Florian talked about, the desire of the soul, right? The will of the soul. There is a wise yet hidden rebuke and a restrictive exhortation, namely that as long as your inner morality does not abhor the eating of animal flesh, as you already abhor the eating of human flesh, in regard to which it is not necessary for the Torah to make an explicit prohibition. There we go. So that also is to Florian's question. Then, when the time comes for the human moral condition to abhor eating the flesh of animals because of the moral loathing inherent in that act, you surely will not have the urge to eat meat, and you will not eat it, since we know that with regard to the words of Torah, the positive is inferred from the negative and the negative from the positive. And that's a common method for interpreting Torah that he cites from Nedarim. All right, Jen, yeah, what are your thoughts? You're muted.
Right. Always. I'm an itinerant vegetarian, so like it's weird because I stand on both sides of this depending on the day. But I kind of like something about this, like I'm having an emotional pull toward it. And I think it's because I'm hearing this and I'm thinking about how we treat children, where we hold children to a different standard, but we know they're going to grow into a different place. Like, you know, my nephew's over and has a tantrum because he doesn't want to eat part of his dinner and runs into the other room. And I'm like, okay, this is what my nephew does. And he's 5. And if he did that at 25, we'd have an issue. And so there's something very loving rather than condescending in the things that I'm reading here. Whereas at first I felt like it was really condescending. And I'm thinking about how mutual it is, right? Because like the other person who's like doing a lot of what we would call immoral killing in the Torah is God. Mm-hmm. And our relationship with God is a little bit about, okay, that whole flood thing, that wasn't really cool, but like we're growing and we're going to figure this out. And so the other metaphor I can think of is when you get into a relationship with somebody and you know that you've got some baggage and some ways of being that you're going to have to work through, and you're going to grow in your relationship. And eventually those behaviors that you think like are kind of not cool, not to trivialize, but like my wife leaving wet towels on the floor, something like that, they're going to grow into a new place with that. So like I kind of see a mutual loving, supporting, scaffolding kind of perspective going on here.
I love it, and I buy it, right? That he's talking about, like, he's stepping back and he's saying, like, okay, yes, like, you have certain things that seem right to you, right? This is the metric by which we measure mitzvot, right? Like, do I intuit this mitzvah or don't I? And he's like, well, no, the things you intuit, they change, right? Like, they grow with you. And one day the world, so he's like, the world was in a state of relative perfection, or I guess perfection isn't relative. So the world was in a state of perfection and descended. That's the whole process we see in Genesis, is a process of like descending from perfection. But know that by the end times, you're going to go back up to that state, and you'll be back in a state where, like, you can live within that perfect framework that you got. Chaim.
I just have a problem with his moral philosophy. I don't actually understand it. Like, he's not, I mean, I don't get, like, what is his moralistic argument of why vegetarianism is correct? I mean, to me, it sounds a very Kantian a priori, vegetarianism is correct because it's moral, but I don't, like, you know, like, if I look as a religious person, like, or from an outside perspective, and says doing X in the Torah is correct because God said so, you know, there's an outside logic to it. To me, I don't see, I'm probably missing it, but I don't see that of why, of what he's intuiting about why vegetarianism is 100% moral, outside of it just being moral.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. And I think part of that has to do with the way that I cut down this really long treatise into something that we could cover in this short period of time. And some of it is just, you're right, it's just like, if you don't think that that vegetarianism is morally right, then you don't have a conflict with the simple interpretation of the Torah, and his resolution of the conflict might not be meaningful to you. I think that's a really fair criticism. So I do want to keep going so that we can get into his exploration of prophecy. And I have to tell you, for me personally, this is the part of Cook's treatise that I find the most compelling. He goes into the works of the prophets and pulls several passages that he says demonstrate that this is where humanity is destined to go, into vegetarianism. And more broadly, really what he's talking about is veganism. He talks the most about vegetarianism, but he does also, it's not covered here so much, but he talks about wool and dairy a lot, and like how those fit into the vision. So he says, when humanity arrives at its goal of happiness and complete freedom, when it reaches that high peak of wholeness, which is the pure knowledge of God and the sanctification of life fulfilled according to its nature, then human beings will recognize their relationship with all the animals, who are their companions in creation, and how they should properly be able, from the standpoint of pure morality, to combine the standard of mercy with the standard of justice, in particular relation to the animals. I will make a covenant for them with the beasts of the field and the birds of the air and the creeping things of the ground. I will also banish bow, sword, and war from the land. And according to the worthiness of their heightened rank in the course of this development, resulting from the general spiritual elevation which influences the emotion and the senses, with the effect of sharpening and clarifying them, their heightened, this refers to the animals' heightened rank. Here, the true form will emerge, and the cattle and the asses that till the soil shall partake of salted fodder that has been winnowed with shovel and fan. That's Isaiah 30:24. For their sense taste will develop in proportion to the uplifting of their souls in a delicate manner that corresponds to the measure of development of the other aspects of their souls. Right. So what's the vision here? Anybody want to speak out how Rabbi Cook sees this end time scenario? What's the relationship between people and animals? Do people just stop relying on animals in his vision of end times? See some shaking heads. No, they don't. But oh, there we go. A hand. Matthew Webster.
Okay. What seems to be important here is to me, is mercy on one hand and justice on the other hand. Basheva Singer was talking about mercy as opposed to the act of killing an animal. And that struck me as not congruous with my own experience because, I raised in the place where I was raised, a sort of ex-urban suburb. I was killing animals as a practical matter before or just around when I was young enough to remember. And fishing and cleaning the fish, and eating them as well. The first job I had, I think, with a paycheck was at a restaurant, and part of my job was just to put a lobster in a broiler and push a button, and then the lobster was gone, or was dead, and I was troubled by this. So I think it's important to think of killing and mercy as not necessarily mutually exclusive. I think of, for example, fishing, which I still do. I would never take a fish home or kill a fish that I wasn't going to eat. That's a sacred ethic, and so I put a lot of time into not only finding the fish but dispatching it humanely. And I think about the moral aspect every time that I have to do this. So, and I think there's something in the very high standard of tzedakah or ethics within Judaism that causes us to return to this again and again. That it's not as simple as the rules of kashrut.
And I think you give some great examples of that. There's a similar tradition that I think was the Baal Shem Tov, who reproached one of his students for picking a blade of grass and said, you shouldn't even pick a blade of grass if you have no intention of using it. This is similar to what Payam said, in that, I'm kind of starting, because of my biases, I think, with the assumption that that's not true, right? That there is a kind of a moral imperative not to kill the animal for your own use. But you're saying, and I think fairly, well, like that's just your assumption, man. Right? And absent that, there is a different balance that can be present here, which involves a certain vision. Jen.
Matthew got me all excited about this, so I'm going to try not to gush. Okay, but like this distinction between mercy and justice, I hadn't thought of that before. Like, there's plenty of unjust things that we can do mercifully, right? We can fight for prison reform so that prisoners are treated well. We can have executions that are merciful. We can make arguments about how they're done and be upset about them being done in a certain way. Or we can say, this system is wrong. This way that we're treating, in this case, in the examples I'm giving, people, isn't fair, isn't just, isn't consistent with our values. So we should stop it. And wow, those are so different. And I hadn't even thought about how different those really are. We can make all sorts of value judgments about like what is merciful and what isn't, but like they're really different argumentative categories when we talk about what's ethical. And I'd never thought of that before, but that explains so many inconsistencies in the way that we treat humans.
Sure. And you don't even have to go into the macro social level. I mean, if a poor person comes to you and asks for money, the just thing to do would be not to give them money. The merciful thing to do would be to give them money. And like, how do you, like, which do you choose in that circumstance, right? Or maybe that's not even a fair assertion that it's just not to give the poorest person money, but for the sake of argument, right? So that's something we run into on the daily. And kind of what the essence of this text says is like, it isn't just, oh, baby's crying a little bit, so we're gonna put a bottle in her mouth, and yeah, we're gonna hope that'll resolve it. Like when you get folded into that, right? Like when you are part of that paradigm of justice and mercy, then you become more sophisticated and you gain access to more things. That, you know, now these animals are going to expect to eat salted fodder, right? Like they're going to have taste buds that desire things, right? Because their state has been elevated. And it's, to me, it's a vision that says like, yes, we're still going to have this relationship with animals where we benefit from them, but it's not going to be a one-sided relationship anymore. That they, like, they'll have a place in it too, and they'll have agency in a way that they don't right now. That's the vision of the end times here. Agnes.
Yeah, this, everything you're saying and all this conversation about justice and mercy has got made my brain frothing in exciting ways too. It feels like, I feel like the way justice and mercy are often framed in the context of talking about systems is that mercy is sort of the optional part that's good to do and justice is the obligated part. But I think what's kind of incredible in what Rav Kook is saying is that it's, what changes in the course of this movement towards end times is a heightened sensitivity to the possibility of relationship. Like it's that there's a felt relationship that can become possible between humans and animals. And I wonder if that's, I'm trying to read that back into the mercy justice thing, that like, in some ways, if another way of framing justice is that justice is the realm of rules that we use, like the fences we build around the Torah, the rules that we use as a shorthand to compensate for the fact that everybody's felt experience of the world is different. And mercy is when we have this heightened emotional felt relationship. In the end times, we sort of get like elevated out of the realm of justice. We don't need rules anymore because we're operating based on this feeling that we have of relationship with other beings, whether they're human or animal. And I wonder if that's like, I guess I wonder whether it's, you know, is to say that one is a vegetarian or a vegan, is that operating in the realm of justice or mercy? Is that a set of rules that I give myself as sort of like, in my mind, it's like about building a fence around the Torah. Like I'd rather just sort of stay away from certain kinds of violence.
Okay.
Or is vegetarianism, veganism in the realm of mercy? Like, I feel like there's another like axis of evolution that I could be moving along that's separate from the axis of like what rules in terms of what food I eat I give myself. Does that make any sense?
Gotcha. Yeah, well, it does. And then I would just ask you, and if you have the answer to this, is like, what's keeping us from having that relationship? What's that barrier?
I think it's, I mean, I think it's like our ears are only tuned to a certain frequency of sounds. There's a limit within which we're tuned. And I think that what limits our frequency of sounds we're able to hear is the ways in which our ears are battered by the noise. I'm like, this is not scientifically true. I'm sort of jumbling a bunch of metaphors, but like, I think there's so much cruelty in our world. I think this is related to conversations I've had about white supremacy too. There's so much cruelty as part of one's world that there's like a kind of emotional, moral shutting down that has to happen. And I think that as it becomes possible to undo the calcification from that, then we're able to hear more and feel more and see more. So I think that that's my gut response to your question, which doesn't have an answer.
Well, I think that aligns really well with what Rabbi Kook is saying, that like we live in a world that's saturated with violence, and we are individually, collectively in the process of like untraining ourselves from that, and that vegetarianism is a sort of destination and not not something, this, and again, this goes back to, he wasn't a vegetarian at the time when he was writing. He was never a vegetarian, even as he wrote this work. And that's because he saw this as a destination for the end times, not as a reality for the current times. So we got 5 more minutes. I do want to cover the last little bit of his exploration of prophecy. All right, so he just talked about the animals becoming sophisticated enough to eat salted fodder. And in a still small voice does the wisdom of Israel speak through the Kabbalah. The level which animal life will attain in the future will be like the present standpoint of the speaker, i.e. humanity, because of the ascent of the worlds. This is not something I'm prepared to speak to with much authority, really any authority. But it's always nice when we can bring in some Kabbalah. And this is the glory of the picture portrayed for us by the prophets regarding the enlightened condition of even the predatory animals. The cow and the bear shall graze, their young shall lie down together, and the lion like the ox shall eat straw. A babe shall play over a viper's hole, and an infant pass its hand over an adder's den. In all my sacred mount, none shall hurt or destroy, for the earth shall be filled with the knowledge of God, as the waters cover the sea. And I don't know about y'all, but like I've studied these end times texts 1,000 times, and no one ever like pointed out to me in all the times that I studied them before reading Rabbi Koch's work, that like they're all talking about predatory animals not eating meat anymore, right? Like we're predatory animals. So what is the state of this world in which, you know, a toddler can toy around with the snake and the snake knows not to bite that toddler? Like what is that alternate reality? What does that mean? Anyone got, I mean, we got 3 more minutes for any closing thoughts from anyone. In particular, if there are people who haven't spoken yet who would like to. That's it, everyone's worn out. Well, I don't exactly know what it means either, right? Like, and particularly as someone who doesn't really have an inclination to eat meat, but I think there is something that is extremely compelling about the imagery of these creatures who only have this drive and don't have any rational overrides to this drive, right? Like all that they have is instinct. The bear can't say, oh, well, I don't think I'll eat meat today, right? The viper can't say, I think I won't bite the child today. Even at that level, like these instincts change. And I'm seeing Rabbi Kasher raise his hand, which is too good to turn down.
I learned how to do it. Yeah, no, and in all of that Isaiah imagery is very Garden of Eden, you know, it's very, and the way you're describing it now, like a state in which we all just sort of like are in harmony and act according to our instincts, and that would lead us to harmony, would be almost like, it's like pure nature, but it's so pure nature that it's actually, it feels beyond like what we think of as nature.
I love it. Yes, that's right. Because you're right that the animals behaving in this way is not natural. And I think that the question of like what's natural and what's unnatural has been such a destructive question historically, actually, and like such a strange question, because if something occurs, that means it's natural. But we don't know of this occurring, and yet the prophets say it will. Okay, Jen, give us something so great that I'll just.
Oh, no
I
pressure.
just won't be able to
None whatsoever. Well, I'm thinking about the idea of relationship too, and looking at that passage, because the passage is very clear in some places that like the animals being peaceful is awful cool because they're not going to bite your babies. Like,
yes.
Right. And like the lion not wanting to eat meat also means that you don't have to worry about your flocks, and also you can walk through the savannas and not worry about being chased by a lion. So there's also like, they won't hurt us implied in those passages. And some of those passages are very vague about whether it's great that they're not eating straw for the sake of what they would eat or for the sake of us. So I'm thinking about Agnes talking about relationship, right? And I'm seeing mutuality in all of this, that it's not just, you know, the world will be peaceful because you will not hurt them and therefore they will not hurt you, or they will not hurt you and therefore you will not hurt them. It's both directions. And thinking about vegetarianism as being relationship, it's not just like, I'm taking care of these animals because it's just or whatever, but I want to give them love. I want love from them.
I love it. You did it, Jen. You did it. No, that's great. And I think that's what I think that's what vegetarianism is, right? It's like this ability to remove yourself from this idea that you are more important than the animal, and like try to understand what that animal's ultimate fulfillment looks like, and what your ultimate fulfillment looks like, and how those are compatible. And great. I think that's a great note to end on. So with that, thank you, everyone. So good to see you all.